This is the Observations Podcast for the 10th of December, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
And I'm Michael Wade.
And we have quite a lot to talk about this week. I did want to bring up real quickly, last week I called the podcast episode Bidenomics, which I thought was appropriate because pretty much every economic problem we have can be traced back to Bidenomics. And what I was noticing over the last couple of days are the number of economic cheerleading posts that the Biden administration has publicly released on places like Twitter and whatnot about how much better the economy is for the average person, blah, blah, blah. And all I could think was, if anybody deserves a Hugo Award for 2024, it has to be Biden's press people with their talk about how good the economy is. And I bring it up again because I saw this week, and I really wanted to talk about it, and it is this graph. In white, we are seeing the defense budget of the United States, total spending, and in red, we are seeing payments, interest payments alone on the national debt, and we have now hit $900 billion a year on interest payments alone. I think it's really interesting because this is something that we talked about. We've been talking about this for quite a while. I know that in 1918 and 1919, we were talking about it because we were looking at interest rates rise. That sort of pulled back thanks to COVID. But since 2022, the jump in interest payments has been staggering as we are now, we have spent ourselves into $33 trillion in debt. It's kind of hard to think that, 5 years ago, we were talking about $20 trillion in debt and how bad that was. There's no way that I can look at this and see a good end. I suppose there's some way that we could, slash all government spending and make this red line stop going up nearly, straight up. But I don't think we will.
Well, and that red line corresponds to the Fed raising interest rates. We had basically zero, and even at times negative interest rates. So, it's hard to, acclimate to this steep rise, which we haven't seen in the last 20 some years.
No, we have lived in a low interest rate regime since 2000, since the dot-com crash. So after the dot-com crash at the end of 1999 and going into 2000, things didn't look great. And of course, we went into a recession. Interest rates fell. They started to climb back up. But of course, 2008 got us the housing crisis, which really helped a lot in terms of interest rates. It didn't help a lot for anything else, but it helped in terms of interest rates. And we have been at near zero interest rates for a historically long period of time. Historically low and historically long low interest rate regime. If that is turning, and it certainly appears that it is, especially now that inflation has started to raise its ugly head and it has to be combated, then I don't know how you trend this number down. And I can remember us talking about this back in the early mid-aughts and talking about how if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to end up spending $1 to $1.4 trillion a year in just interest rate payments alone. Okay, well, we're at 900 now. So
I was going to say we're about there.
Yeah. So we're almost there. We're approaching the bottom tier of what we were afraid of. And I don't know how we managed to keep Social Security and Medicare running, which takes up 2/3 of all federal spending. Along with everything else the government does, when we are heading towards $1 trillion plus just in interest payments alone. you can maintain quite an air of prosperity by just printing money for a long time. And you can borrow money forever. I mean, you could max out all of your credit cards, and right up to the point that those credit cards are maxed out and you start getting to have to pay those payments back. I mean, heck, you can have a nice new car and a new house and a whole bunch of new clothes, and that all looks great, but somebody's got to pay the piper here. And the only way that I can see to pay this piper, and something I've been harping about since 2009, is hyperinflation.
Well, what's even worse is that spending, the printing of dollars. It's not printing of dollars and then, just increasing the money supply at the banks. It's going directly to Congress, and they basically get an interest-free loan. Yes, the denominated dollars are now worth less when they get them in their hands, but they weren't going to spend them wisely anyway. And they use that to pay off their cronies with stupid projects and earmarks and set asides. Yeah, that money does get into the economy and it does expand the money supply, but it does it in the least productive. As a matter of fact, it may be malproductive.
It does it in the least productive and most inefficient way. When you want to talk about government investment, you are almost invariably talking about what economists refer to as malinvestment.
Right. And that's essentially what we're looking at. I mean, it seems like each time we go through a budget and we look at the spending, so we can gear up our GDP, we're looking at an increasing share of GDP that's spent by the federal government and state governments. That's not a sustainable practice. I mean, that's literally bad money chasing good money out of the market.
None of this is sustainable. My fear is that none of this is changeable. We have a Congress that refuses to do their job. I mean, we don't pass budgets anymore in this country, even though we're constitutionally, the House is constitutionally obligated to propose one. They don't. We get these omnibus spending bills and these continuing resolutions, which we have done now for
ever since 1975, essentially.
Well, no, look, we had budgets in the 1990s.
Yes, after 94.
Yeah, but I mean, since then, it's been pretty iffy if we ever get a budget. Okay, great. And the other problem with Congress not doing their jobs is that every time they pass a law, and this has been true my entire life, they don't specify how the law is to be enforced. Ever. And they don't set out what the rules are. What they do is they say, the Secretary of X shall be empowered to enforce this legislation with the appropriate regulation. And so what we've really built is Congress saying, okay, well, here's a law, and then the executive departments saying, okay, now we get to determine what that law is, what it says, how it is enforced. We get to promulgate the regulations for that. Does Congress go back and take a look at those regulations? No. Why would they? They've already moved on to whatever the next current thing is. And so there's literally no oversight. And I can remember, and
that's the whole thing about Chevron deference, by the way. I know that term has been bantied around at times in the news world, especially when Gorsuch was elevated to the bench. And Chevron was a case that is still good law, where basically the Supreme Court said that it's not an impermissible delegation of authority from Congress to the executive branch for these agencies to make regulations that are binding by law, as long as it goes through, by the procedures that Congress has set out in the APA. Well, as part of that, there's a case involving Chevron, and the court ruled that, well, look, this is a lot of detailed expertise stuff, and who gets it right and who gets it wrong is really just a battle of experts, and that's what the agencies are for, to do their thing. So we got to have a lot of deference to what they come up with and their findings and their conclusions. So we're not going to step into the place. And that has been used to create a giant hole in the APA and in the ability for executive agencies to expand their power. So, when you hear things about, Chevron deference and it possibly going by the wayside, this is exactly what we're talking about. The Congress doesn't have the power; these agencies do. The executive branch does.
Back in the 1980s, and when I was in Europe, one of the most popular programs on the BBC at that time was a program called Yes, Minister, which eventually became Yes, Prime Minister. I have them all on DVD so that I can actually keep them and watch them. One of the interesting things about that show, which was written with a lot of inside knowledge from people who actually worked both in the government on the elected side in Parliament and also on the civil service side, was that there was this permanent civil service who saw it as their job to implement the appropriate policies for the government. And there was a general theory, a general feeling that ministers in a parliamentary system come and go all the time. And I think as one of the main characters said, if I had to believe in what the government said was proper policy, I would have been both for and against national service. I would have been for and against the death penalty. I would have been for and against immigration. And I also would have been a stark raving lunatic. Okay, granted that is true. The trouble is that is a very true picture of government, not just in the UK, but here in the United States. We talk about the deep state, which I think the way a lot of people put it has sort of this more Trumpian connotation of people who are, have wormed their way into the bowels of the government to pervert the workings of democracy. Not entirely sure that that's what is happening, although I wouldn't put it past some of these people. But I think
they certainly are working more in their own interests.
Yeah, exactly.
Than ours.
And I think that is a true picture of what goes on in the United States government as well, which makes me wonder who actually runs things. We have this theory of elected government where the will of the people determines who our leaders are going to be. They create policies, and it is the job of the government to create those policies in a neutral and fair manner, whether they agree with them or not. I don't believe that happens. And I think I could probably come up with lots of examples, the FBI currently being one of the most, and the DOJ as a whole, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, where I don't know whose interest is being served. What I do know is that if you have a system where the civil service basically, and here's the thing, it's not even that they can subvert the workings of government. Like you said, they are the experts. So they can always come up with papers about why this policy can't be implemented and why it must be delayed. And if you can overcome those objections, they can rewrite and come up with new ones. Their list of objections can be endless. And as a politician, you're not really a expert in every possible thing that government does. And so they have the ability to slow roll any changes that they don't like. So a president who actually gets something done is really unusual today. And I think our civil service, very much like the British civil service, exists as a monument to inertia more than anything else.
A monument to self-sustaining.
Oh yes, they have quite a lot of inertia if it was to come to, well, let's just cut the civil service by 50%.
Oh, wow.
Or not even that, even something simple like let's just move the Department of the Interior to, Montana.
Yeah.
And let's move the Department of Commerce to Kansas City. Nobody wants to do that either.
That's a long way to commute for a party.
Exactly. So this chart worries me. Peter Kalle, I I'm going to assume that you have a Germanic pronunciation of your last name, Mr. Colley, says, I'd love to see the chart since 1980. I would too, and I could have shown such a chart had I been bothered to go to the CBO's website, download the data set, open it up in Excel, and regenerate it. It was far more easy to find an existing chart like this, and so that's what I used. But I'm sure that the chart since actually, you know what? I think that chart since 1980s, I don't know, but I don't think it would be quite as frightening. I think the chart in the late 80s and mid 90s would be a little frightening. And by the way, this is the interesting thing. If you remember in the presidential debates in both 92 and 96, one of the chief issues in both of those presidential campaigns was the state of the national debt. I remember Lloyd Benson in his debate against Dan Quayle in 1992 saying, yeah, it's really easy to look rich if you can write $300 billion in bad checks every year, which, by the way, he's absolutely right. We don't seem to have the same level of caution or concern in the electorate now as we had back in the 1990s. And I don't know how to explain that other than we've been hearing predictions of doom about our debt for so long, and it has failed to happen for so long that everybody just figures it's a bunch of malarkey.
Well, there's probably a little bit of that inkling in people that, the saying, if you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you. If you own the bank $1 trillion, then you own the bank. And yeah, we have a lot of debt out there, but it's to a lot of different places, including a lot of our enemies. And, tanking it doesn't do them any good. Really does nobody any good. So it is a little bit of, I guess, a shield as much of as a sword.
Well, there's also the one saving grace is if you're, iffy about U.S. markets and about the U.S. fiscal outlook. Okay, so what's your fallback?
Right.
Okay, what financial market?
That's the biggest problem.
What financial market do you go to where those problems don't exist? It's not the Nikkei. It's
nope.
It's not the FTSE 100. It's not the DAX. It's not the Hang Seng Index. I mean, speaking of inertia, there is something to be said about the inertia of being the world's financial center.
Yeah. Although technically, I think London has taken over from New York in the past decade. They have a lot more IPOs. They've got a lot more funds flowing through it, but by and far, the U.S. is head and shoulders, whole body lengths above most countries, pretty much every country, in terms of the number and amount of investment.
And again, I don't see that changing very quickly.
No.
There's just trillions of dollars that are already invested in New York.
I mean, if you wanted to hurt that, then you probably try to drive down the price of the currency. So, print a whole lot of it, maybe have a failed bond auction, stuff that would never happen here, obviously.
Yeah, well, we had a couple of soft bond auctions. And by the way, that's what really keeps me up at night. The idea that the U.S. government comes in and says, okay, we're going to drop in, $200 billion of 30-year notes, right? And it auctions for 9.75%. That's the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, because say what you want about commercial bonds and things like that. The fact is that at this point, with minus the 4.5–5 trillion that the Fed is holding on their balance sheet, we've got 25 or so trillion dollars in a secondary bond market for U.S. Treasuries. It is the 800-pound gorilla for interest rates. And the thing is, if that market decides to take off and that market decides that yields have to be 9.75%, it doesn't matter at all what the Fed wants to do.
Yeah, the Fed's decision making at that point goes out the window.
Because once you have a certain amount of debt, and I would argue that we have it, that the Fed's monetary policy tools are pretty much irrelevant. It's the market that is going to drive interest rates, not the Fed. And the best the Fed can do is, well, really what Paul Volcker did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Just say, okay, we'll just peg whatever the Fed funds rate is to, 2 points below prime. And that's how you end up with a Fed funds rate of 18.5% in 1981.
That's true. And it makes borrowing more costly. So, I mean, theoretically, you would then slow down the, and and then again, we run into the problem of the Fed just printing money going directly into the U.S. Treasury coffers and being spent directly by the federal government. Oh, it goes on the Fed's books, but we don't need to go into that.
We've had that discussion before about the Fed and holding $5 trillion in bonds, and what would happen if the Fed just said, "I pardon you." And I don't know. Fortunately, nobody has seriously talked about it, but it certainly would be a way to. Well, it wouldn't affect the debt that's publicly held, but it would certainly wipe off. Would it wipe off? See, again, let's not even go there.
It would make treasuries really strange.
Yeah, I don't even know what the answer to that question would be. In any event, I am informed probably the first time anyone has pronounced my name correctly the first time. Well, that's because That's because I lived in Germany and I know what Carla means. Speaking of government spending, this week the Republicans decided that if we were going to spend money, the one thing that we needed to spend it on was the border, and they held Ukraine aid up as the carrot or the stick for that carrot. So either spend money on the border to shut the illegal immigration down, or you don't get your Ukraine aid. And Democrats said, okay, then we'll do without the Ukraine aid. So now we've got Vladimir Zelensky, who is, planning to head back here. He wants that money. And of course he wants to visit Congress, and I'm sure he would like nothing better than to visit them after being told here's another 10, 20, 30 trillion dollars.
Well, we haven't said that much, I don't think. It's been, I think we spent about 200 billion
or so. Yeah. He'd like the trillion, but he'd settle for another. Yeah. He'd settle for another 20 billion. Wow, I am so conflicted about this. Not super conflicted, but I am a little conflicted about this. Certainly spending money on securing the border has got to be a top priority. We've talked about this over and over again about why borders are important. And I think the weird thing is, and by the way, you could go back and find clips of Barack Obama and Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton talking about how we needed 634 miles of border fencing to stop this illegal immigration, blah, blah, right up until the point of 2016 when Donald Trump said, I'll close the borders. And then everybody on the Democratic side just jumped out and said, no, we don't want to close the borders at all. We can't do that. That's inconsistent, as Secretary Mayorkas said this week, with our values.
I don't remember the values of letting paupers pour into the country so they can feast off the national teat. Yeah,
this is not 1902. when you stepped off the boat, and as soon as you got out of quarantine in Ellis Island, you were on your own. And these people are coming
and if
in.
you couldn't show that you would be on your that you would be able to support yourself, you were headed right back. You never even touched U.S. soil.
Welcome. Tell everybody in Calabria we said hi because you're heading back there. That, of course, is not what we do. And by the way, something I don't think most people realize, the illegal immigration that we're experiencing now is fundamentally different than the illegal immigration that we were used to 10 or 15 years ago. Because what they're doing now is not sneaking into the border and trying to, hang out at Home Depot and get day jobs because they have no other means of income. They're just coming up and saying, hell, I'm a refugee and you got to handle me under the refugee program, which immediately places an obligation, and I'll use scare quotes for that, on the United States government to provide them with shelter, food, work permits, the whole 9 yards. It's this gaping hole in the system whereby we can have mass, what would otherwise be illegal immigration, but is now at least semi-legalized by this refugee program. So, everybody who says, the police officer looked at me funny in Montevideo. Oh, well, okay, you're a political refugee, and here's a place to live. It is literally the worst of all possible worlds. The one thing we could say about illegal immigration 10 years ago was at least they didn't have access to anything. I mean, sure, if they went to a hospital emergency room, we'd have to treat them. But, well, yeah, we also started doing schools for their children and stuff. But in general, they were out of the system. And it was a little sneaky deal we all made, right? Yeah, we'll kind of turn a blind eye to illegal immigration, but we'll treat you as a permanent underclass. And we're not even doing that anymore. We're like directly violating the Milton Friedmanian you can't have a social welfare program and mass immigration. Well, now we have both. How's that working out?
Yeah, right. Well, and it's even worse than that. I mean, the ultimate goal here is not just the cheap labor that the Chamber of Commerce types like, but it's new voters. You don't like the way your current crop of electorate is voting. Well, we'll bring in a whole bunch of extra people to vote the way that we want them to.
Yeah, this is, by the way, now called the horrible conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement theory. And it is obviously a right-wing, white nationalist conspiracy theory. The only problem is that this theory was first initially propagated in the early 2000s by a Democratic Party strategist who wrote
in Roy Texera.
Yeah, Roy Teixeira, who wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
And
the changing demographics of America.
Yeah, and somehow that has now become a right-wing conspiracy theory. Well,
right.
Yeah, Rui Teixeira's right-wing conspiracy theory. Good. Gotcha. Obviously, we have to do something about the border. And look, if holding up Ukraine aid is what has to be done, perfectly happy to do it. Perfectly happy to do it.
Of all the things that we spend, yeah, that's an absolute legitimate target. I would be less sanguine about it if we had an accounting of what we've already spent in the Ukraine. We knew that Ukraine was corrupt before going into this whole mess.
Yeah, it's an enormously
corrupt as USSR sorry, Russia.
It's every bit as corrupt as Russia. Russia's awfully corrupt.
It seems like it. I mean, their last two presidents went to jail.
The general who heads Russia's military procurement problem has a $2.3 million dacha outside of Moscow. How he gets that on a 5,000 ruble a month general salary, I'll leave to your imagination.
It's good to be part of the nomenclature.
Well, yeah, and it always has been. I mean, this is just a continuation. I don't think it's quite as bad as Henry Kissinger characterized the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which was to say it's too bad both sides can't win.
Right. Ukraine has at least shown inklings of hope. And there's certainly a desire there for a better government. And Ukraine tends to focus its political violence at other politicians and political figures as opposed to,
Internally.
right. So there's some hope there, I suppose, but it's still a pretty corrupt country, and we had to know this was going to be an issue. So the willingness to just keep writing blank checks, it doesn't make any sense really whatsoever. I mean,
Here's the thing, though. Here's the people my age, especially people my age who were, career military. We've never been fans of Russia.
Yeah.
Although we called it the Soviet Union, we all knew it was Russia. And it's still Russia. There was a brief period in the 1990s where it looked like we could be, if not friends, at least not active enemies. That period has passed. Russia is back to being Russia. They are historically aggressive, historically expansionist, whether it's the Soviet Union, current Russia, Imperial Russia. Russia has been a problem. It has been the idiot stepsister to Western civilization for 300 years. And I'm automatically inclined, if Russia attacks a country, to want to support that country. And if they need guns, to give them guns. But
that's what we do with Afghanistan.
Yeah, but look, at some point, you have to sit back and take stock in a way that we never did in Iraq or that we ever did in Afghanistan. Somebody needs to sit back and take stock. And in Inebriated Plutarch writes, I think it's at the point where we need to push Zelensky for a negotiated end to the war. They don't seem to be making serious progress. Look, the way Russia has always won its wars is to spend the lives of millions of people, and even if they win, to do so at the cost of a horrific meat grinder. We know this. Even in the wars they've won, have been largely a disaster. You've got a country with maybe 20 million people who have been fighting for 2 years. The Russians, while not as big as they were, 180 million. This cannot continue. Ukraine, at best, can, with continued support, maintain part of their country as some sort of rump. But the idea that they're going to be able to push the Russians out, quantity has a quality all of its own, as Joseph Stalin reminded us. And I don't think that having not won now after almost 3 years, right? Not 22, 23. So we're starting our third year of the conflict. We cannot afford to give munitions that our country needs to Ukraine forever. That well is not infinite. And so we certainly can't give them money without having some way of control over how it is disbursed, because the number of stories of people in Ukraine who are skimming off the top of every dollar that they get are pretty much unignorable at this point. And like you said, we always knew they were a corrupt country. We figured there'd be some shrinkage, but at this point, I don't know what option anybody has to try to end this. And does this mean Russia keeps Crimea? Yeah, it does. Does it mean they keep the Donbass? Yeah, most likely it does. But Ukraine is eventually going to run out of people to throw into the battlefield, and they'll do it about 10 times quicker than Russia ever will.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I get it. It's hard. It's hard to accept that as a compromise, giving up land, but you can't hold on to it. It doesn't make much sense to spend and slaughter yourself silly trying to, and sacrificing and everything else.
And then there are the other troubling things that are going on in Ukraine anyway. The idea that Zelensky says, no, we're not going to have elections. War is too important. That's a problem. The other thing, although it is partially understandable, is the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church. Granted, there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is not being persecuted, and the guy that runs the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is a Moscow stooge. We get it. But to Western eyes, this all looks like a return to status quo ante for for Russia, which is, let's have a dictator. And so now what are we fighting for? What is it that Ukraine is fighting for other than Zelensky remaining as president? I might have been willing to give quite a lot of money to Ukraine, and indeed was, when it looked like a democratic nation was fighting an unprovoked invasion. It is beginning to look less and less like that is the case. And since that is so, I'm less and less willing to give money to Ukraine. I think, dislike of Russia aside, and there's plenty to dislike about Russia and plenty to dislike about Vladimir Putin, who is a bad guy. But at some point, you got to cut your losses. And I think that the way that Ukraine has been acting in the past 6 or 7 months is pushing us to that point of cutting our losses. If we're not defending some principle, what is it that we're defending? What are we doing other than saying Putin bad?
Yeah, I mean, at least as far as any kind of further appropriations of just directly money. It's one thing to send them arms, food, emergency supplies. We'll do that all day, every day. But if we can't get an accounting, we can't send them just buckets of money. That doesn't seem to make any difference. And it hasn't seemed to make any difference.
I mean, hell, if we're going to do it, we might as well do it efficiently and just send the money straight to numbered Swiss bank accounts
right.
And send them to Ukrainian government officials.
And then we'll tax them.
Just cut out the middle. Just cut out the middleman. Right. So, yeah, I'm very much falling into the idea that it's time for this thing to end, and Ukraine's going to have to give something up. And you know what? Russia probably isn't going to have to give something up. They'll probably get the lion's share of what they've already taken. On the other hand, as far as we can tell, the Russians have probably lost between 200 and 500,000 men.
And their military is in rags.
Yeah. And
not that it was great to begin with, but it's seriously depleted right now.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, gosh darn, I freaking hate the Russians, and I hate to let them win. There's that, there's that lifelong distrust of Russia that I have to overcome. But at this point, I think we got to be done. All we're doing is throwing men into the meat grinder, Ukrainian and Russian, and I don't know that we're going to accomplish anything other than kill a lot more people before Russia gets pretty much what they want anyway, because unless we're willing to actually send our troops in there to fight the Russians, in which case I think we would win, and I think we'd win quickly, right up until the point that the Russians realize they cannot beat us, and then they start launching nukes, then everybody loses. At some point, somebody's got to go. We've taught Russia a lesson. I think that's probably the best we can do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Russia would agree to a ceasefire pretty quickly. If they keep control of the Crimea and the Donbass region, I think they count that as a win.
Yeah, I mean,
which again is why I don't want them to get that.
And by the way, let's be honest, they were already having separatist movements and militia in those regions anyway. So they were, de jure under Ukrainian control. I think de facto, those areas were under Russian control as well.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's a very knotty situation, and I don't know how to untangle that knot. And that is knotty, not naughty. Although, speaking of naughty situations, Hunter Biden almost got away with everything scot-free. Right up
for those meddling whistleblowers.
Right up until the whistleblowers came out and said, hey, he's getting a sweetheart deal, and the federal judge in charge of his case just started asking questions about the plea agreement. And in a single courtroom session with just a couple of questions to the government's prosecutors, The entire deal fell apart in real time. So now, even though he has not been indicted on any FARA charges, and some of the more egregious charges have now fallen out of the statute of limitations, they are getting him on tax issues. And of course, he's still.
And there's serious tax issues too. I mean, these aren't slap on the wrist type tax issues.
And the gun charge is now going through.
Yeah.
So he's now being tried on the gun charge as well, which they were going to let him walk on. They were going to put him into diversion through that gun charge, which, by the way, is supposed to be a mandatory felony. Okay. Well, doesn't look like he's going to walk, although we have no mention of his father or anything like that in this. It just goes to show it's interesting that if it hadn't been for those whistleblowers, this thing would all be over.
Yeah, this is a great example of modified limited hangout. And why you have so many capos around the head of the regime, so that there are people who can take the fall, and you have no fingerprints. So the Bidens aren't quite as crafty as that, nor as smart. They've left trails all over the place.
And yet it doesn't matter how crafty or smart you are if nobody is going to pick up the trail.
Yeah, and that's been kind of the problem. There's still no evidence linking Joe Biden. I mean, he's got checks directly from his brother and his son. And we know where that money came from.
But none of those checks say bribe money to Joe.
Loan repayment.
They say things like loan repayment. In fact,
why was Joe lending y'all money if you're the one making all the millions of dollars?
Yeah, where's Joe getting
overseas?
Where's Joe getting the $200,000 to loan you? Right. Now, it is true that the Republicans, like Jim Comer, really overstates a lot of stuff. I woke up early.
I noticed that.
Yeah, I woke up early this last week to this, House GOP or GOP oversight, whatever the Twitter committee is for the GOP oversight committee. I think it is GOP oversight. And it was, we now have checks that Hunter Biden paid to Joe Biden after receiving millions from China. Huh?
Yeah, for a total about $9,000.
No, not $9,000, $4,200. Over 3 months. Monthly payments over 3 months that are marked Ford Raptor payment. And so, the first impression I get from hearing this announcement, which comes, of course, from Comer, who runs that committee, is, okay, they found the smoking gun, did they? Then you open up and look at it, and it was, 3 payments of $1,700. Total amount, I think, was $4,180 that Joe received over 3 months. After Hunter Biden had received like $10 million from the Chi-Coms. That seems like a very, very small percentage of the amount that he got from the Chi-Coms. So,
well, although, to be honest, legally speaking, it doesn't matter. There's no de minimis amount.
Yes, that's correct. 1 penny would be enough to prove it if you could prove it. But of course, those checks don't say Chi-Com kickbacks to dad. They say Ford Raptor payment. So we still haven't found it. Here's the thing. I am firmly convinced that Joe Biden is so crooked, he needs a brace of Secret Service agents to screw his pants on every morning. And yet, there doesn't seem to be a smoking gun. Although, admittedly, that doesn't seem to be something the FBI is eager to look for. And which takes us back to what we talked about, the deep state, and these agencies have their own agendas in mind, whatever they may be, largely their own self-preservation and the increase of their own powers. And one thing that you don't want to do is go after the family of the sitting president unless you absolutely have to, because the president actually controls all the appointments and everything else. So, self-preservation. How much of this is the FBI just trying not to piss off Joe Biden so that he doesn't do something, angrily to make them look bad or to reduce their power? So
You have
And
to admit,
how
though,
much might
that
he reward them if they shield Hunter Biden to the extent that they can from
and they
prosecution?
don't seem to be doing that now. I mean, they're still shielding, but these are serious charges. And this kind of gives me the inkling. And I said all along, I didn't think that Joe was going to be on the ballot next November. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump's not either. But the Democrats are desperate to either shore Joe up or get him out of the way. And wow, this would be a good way to help get him out of the way and keep their, icky fingers off the direct cause of why
Yeah, but
Biden has to get out of the way.
The trouble is the Democrats don't sit in the White House, and the Democrats can't fire the FBI director or change up things at the DOJ. It's only Joe Biden that can do that. So whatever your worries
You
about,
think he knows that?
well, he might have sometime before 2016, but whether he does now, who knows? But at least something is happening. And if it hadn't been for those whistleblowers, the Department of Justice would have put this under the courthouse. You would never have heard of it. He would have walked clean. He would have gotten some form of probation. He would have gotten diversion on the gun charges, which are, again, supposed to be a mandatory felony. And he never would have spent a day in jail. Those whistleblowers.
These are the very gun laws that Democrats talk about all the time. Common sense gun laws that they want to enforce.
Yeah.
Except now.
Yeah. Well, let's enforce them. We have a clear-cut case of a guy who lied on his background check. So why aren't we that interested in it? Well, we all know why, because his father's the president and his father's a Democrat. So we don't care if we're Democrats. And look, he almost got away with it. It's like a Scooby-Doo episode. I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you meddlesome whistleblowers. But doesn't look like he's going to get away with it. I mean, I assume at this point that
at least
he's going to be.
He's not going to get away with all of it. He's going to. I'd still expect that this is going to enter some sort of plea deal with, some jail time, maybe a week or two, something.
6 months at some
suspended.
6 months at some club fed where he can, play tennis.
Yeah. Well, if those exist, I don't know if they do or don't. But
I thought there was a couple of real minimum security federal prisons for these white collar guys that were pretty cushy.
Oh no, it's federal pound me in the ass prison.
Yeah. You mentioned Trump and the nomination. Whether Biden will be the nominee, he seems to think he will be, and he's running. And interestingly, this last week, Gavin Newsom said, "Oh no, I would not primary Joe Biden. He's our guy." And you can believe as much of that as you please, but at least that's his public statement. On the other hand, on the other party side, we have Donald Trump, who, by the way, just announced that he is not going to be testifying on Monday in his New York civil fraud case. So he came out on Truth Social and just said he's not having any of it. I've already testified to everything and have nothing more to say other than this is complete and total election interference. Biden campaign, witch hunt. That was his all caps post on Truth Social. He is the master of all caps posting. So he's not going to testify. I think it's a foregone conclusion that the Trump organization gets the death penalty in New York in terms of business licenses.
At the trial level, yeah.
Yeah. Now, whether that's going to happen at the appeal level, but at the trial level, I think I hate to say this, I even hate to say the fix is in. I think we know where Judge Engoron is going to go on this. I think he's already made it pretty clear what his opinion is on this case. Yeah. And, we could talk about whether that is impartial enough for a judge or not. But then we would also have to talk about why didn't his attorneys demand a jury trial?
Well, I can explain to you exactly why. because he doesn't stand a chance in front of the jury. They'll vote emotional.
Yeah,
With the judge,
it is a Manhattan jury.
right. So with the judge, at least having facts and law in front of him allegedly should lead him to the right conclusions. Um, Also, you can't overturn a jury trial, a jury decision, as easily as a bench trial, because while uh, appellate courts are quite loath to step into the shoes of jurors, they don't mind stepping on other judges because eventually they're going to be getting, they are going to be looking at this de novo, which means they're going to just start from the bottom and look at it just like it was in the trial court. So they're going to look at all the facts, presentation of the facts. They're going to look at the legal issues that were decided in court, and everything that's complained about in the appeal is really going to be on those two grounds. What the judge found, is that, beyond, is it what's the standard? It's not. I don't think it's abuse. I think it's just whether or not it's reasonably justified. But and then looking at the decisions on the law, and having at least paid attention to this trial around the edges, I think there are a lot of good legal appeals here that
One of which is having
might get him another trial.
Yeah, one of which is one of the guys from Deutsche Bank walking up there and saying he didn't defraud us. We knew exactly what was going on. This is everybody does this.
The judge made the decision that, well, obviously this is proven. The fraud is proven. Now we're just going to decide the impact. It's like, wait, what? Because you're just going to choose to believe these ridiculous numbers? You honestly think that Mar-a-Lago is worth under $1 million?
Well,
that doesn't even make any sense.
I think the valuation the judge put on Mar-a-Lago was $23 million.
He put a lot less on it.
No, I thought $23 million or $18 million, something like that was the number.
It's worth a hell of a lot more.
Not that it matters, because you can go to Zillow and you can see a lot right next to it that's a quarter of the size that sold more recently at $79 million.
Yeah, I know houses on that beach that are worth over $100 million that aren't far away from Mar-a-Lago. It's ridiculous that thing is valued at anything less than probably 250 to 300 million. It's not just a house, in a property, an estate. It's a functioning business. It's a country club. So it not only exists,
well, it's a beach club
and has an innate value, it also has a running value in its ability to create commerce.
Because it's an income producing property.
Right.
So any sort of assessment of just what the land value might be, and 23 million is, it's ridiculous. There's no way that property is worth only $23 million. I guarantee you Trump could sell that for 200 million plus.
Oh, easily. Tomorrow.
Yeah. And people would snap it up at that price.
The other part of that is that somehow Trump was able to secure these loans on property that only had his and his team's assessed value. That the banks didn't do anything at all to go out there and appraise the value, to look at the numbers, do any due diligence whatsoever, and then agree to the value that eventually was insured.
And then get paid back the money that they loaned on time, in full, and somehow fraud was committed.
The only difference would have been, well, I guess they could have said, no, we just won't give you a loan. Okay, then it'll go somewhere else. But really the only difference was going to be in the interest rate he was paying. And that's the only difference. He was going to get the loan. but it was just going to make a difference on how much interest he was going to have to pay. If he had valued at 23 million, well, he wouldn't have gotten the loan.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how the New York Court of Appeals does this after this case is gone.
Well, and that's the other thing. This is going to take forever because he can't go directly to federal court.
No, he's going to have to go through the New York system first. So it goes from
there's no guarantee. As a matter of fact, it's a lot less likely to go from a state's highest court to the Supreme Court unless there's some sort of federal or constitutional issue. And really, I think at that point, it has to be strictly a federal issue
that can be adjudicated.
That can be adjudicated. That the Supreme Court can actually provide relief for. Which means it would have to basically rule that the highest court in the state for New York violated either the state's constitution or the federal constitution. And I think those are the only two ways that he can get relief.
Although my understanding is that the New York Court of Appeals, the trial court in New York is called the Supreme Court.
Supreme Court.
And their Supreme Court is called the Court of Appeals. All right, whatever. My understanding is the Court of Appeals isn't quite as full goose loony as you might see down in Manhattan.
That's true. But it is still very liberal.
And it's New York. It's like the Ninth Circuit. It's going to be what it is.
Right.
But you said something interesting. You're not entirely sure that Trump is going to be the nominee. Now, I'm fascinated by looking at these polls that show Donald Trump with 50%, 55% of the primary voters in a nationwide poll who are going to vote for him. I just don't know if that is believable. I mean, is it
I don't know. It's so hard to say now. I mean, they also say that, the vast majority of Democrats won't vote for Biden, but we know how that always works. I'm not voting Democrat. And then the day comes and they're like, damn it, hold your nose and you vote Democrat. Yeah, a lot of people do the same thing with Republicans.
Yeah, it's like we talked about last week. Your opinion about a politician or what have you is much different when you're standing in the booth than it is as a hypothetical matter 3 months, 6 months ahead of time. I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if we walked into Iowa and at the end of those caucuses, Ron DeSantis had 40%.
Well, he's already got quite a bunch of endorsements. I mean, Iowa's a nothing bellwether. South Carolina is where you find out.
Yeah, but Iowa is, as a practical matter, Iowa is utterly irrelevant. As a psychological matter, it is not. Although if winning,
you think so?
Well, I will admit that if winning Iowa won the nomination, then Ted Cruz would have been president in 2016. But still,
right. And didn't Bernie win Iowa? Oh no, that's right. They tricked Bernie. Forgot.
But here's the thing, though. If the theory that I'm seeing on Twitter is that all these big poll numbers for Trump are really being pushed by mainstream media, specifically to try to get Republicans to think of Trump as being inevitable and to vote for him in the primaries to try to ensure Trump is the nominee, because they believe, and not without reason, that Donald Trump can't win a presidential election. He cannot get 270 electoral votes.
It's the same reason that Rush Limbaugh did the whole Operation Chaos thing for Hillary Clinton, hoping that Hillary would be the nominee instead of Barack Obama, because she just attracts not only so much attention but so much negative attention.
Yes, Hillary Clinton is a historically unpopular presidential candidate.
And Trump has a lot of same trappings.
Yeah.
He
So,
drives turnout for the other side as much as he does for his own.
yeah, and that's a problem. What you want
Right.
is somebody on your side who the public wants to vote for, but who the other side doesn't much care about.
Well, or somebody that they simply write off as such a nobody. Reagan comes to mind, even Trump the first time. They were happy to pump Trump up and keep talking about what a doofus he was, um and just what a bad person he was, blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
that's because they didn't
Well,
realize how bad a politician Hillary Clinton was.
exactly. She's even worse than Joe Biden.
Yeah, why would I go to Pennsylvania? I got that in the bag. Why would I go to
Wisconsin?
Wisconsin?
I don't know, where's is Wisconsin a state?
Yeah, it's a flyover state. Who cares about that? Um, and by the way, we do have to point out that Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was by a razor thin majority in a couple of states.
Well, and
Razor
Joe
thin.
Biden's was in a handful of states too. So I mean,
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
this is kind of where we are.
nobody has had a Ronald Reagan runaway election
No.
since Ronald Reagan in
Since Ronald Reagan,
1984.
yeah, literally nobody.
And so, uh,
Matter of fact, Barack Obama may be the only popularly elected and electorally elected.
yeah, since 2000, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, actually, before that,
Yeah, before that, because Clinton
Clinton never got a
majority.
majority. Nope. And George H.W. Bush did not get a majority.
Yeah, yeah. So,
But actually, his first
Reagan.
election, he did. It was,
We only had one.
yeah, it was 92. And
No, it was 88.
no,
88
no, the election of 92, nobody
was
got a
when Clinton
majority.
won.
That was when Clinton won with 43%.
Right.
And other than Barack Obama, no one who has been elected president has gotten a majority of the popular vote. They've
Right.
always won in the Electoral College.
Yes.
Although one has to point out that in 2016, we always hear Hillary Clinton, she won the majority of the popular vote. Yes, entirely due to California. If you pull California out of the mix, because her lead in California was so big, that 3 million vote lead goes away. And
No, Obama did get a majority both times.
yes, but everybody wanted to vote for Obama, and
Right.
he got it both times.
Although he squeaked in what was that? I guess
12.
12.
Yeah, well, but
Still don't understand how Mitt Romney lost that thing.
But as we go into the primaries, one of the things about pushing Donald Trump the way that he's been pushed, and looking at these polls showing him at 50% plus in all of the polls, and this air of inevitability, that, by the way, Donald Trump is doing everything he can to push himself. Why do I need to show up in the debates? I'm ahead by 50 points. I don't need to debate these losers. I am the nominee. In fact, we shouldn't even have any debates. We should just go, he said, I think 2 weeks ago, they should just declare me the nominee right now and forget about the primaries. I'm not sure that's the argument of someone who's confident of winning primaries, but that aside. And given the fact that, yes, in real terms, the Iowa caucuses don't mean much, and neither does a whole bunch of, backwoods bear trappers in New Hampshire tell us much either. Except that in Trump's case, when you walk into it saying, I am the inevitable nominee, I am so inevitable that we don't even need to have primaries, then he's got to win all those primaries. And he's got to win them by a lot. And if he doesn't, if we're at the end of December or middle of January and he has lost Iowa and he has lost New Hampshire, I think we have an entirely different game for 2024.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, but my observation has always been that the race doesn't get going until, for Republicans at least, until South Carolina. And then Super Tuesday is when the leader's really established. So I'd have to say right now that I know Haley is up there pretty high in South Carolina, um, but she's still not at Trump levels. So maybe that is the writing on the wall, but I don't know what it is. I don't have any specific evidence to offer you. Unfortunately, I can't make an empirical
Yeah, me either.
an empirically based argument as to why. I just have this feeling that Trump's just not going to be the one. I don't know why that is. I'm just telling you.
Well, I think he has to win, and he has to win big right from the start. I get what you're saying about how on the Republicans, until you get to Super Tuesday and North Carolina, it doesn't really matter. I think that would be true in a normal political year. I think in a year where you have a candidate who has gone so far as to say is inevitable, and he's touting these 55% plus poll ratings. And then recently, national polls coming out from places like Rasmussen, and you can believe as much of that as you please, that Trump beats Biden by 4% nationally. Okay, maybe, but
who cares?
But who cares? But the whole idea, I think, at this point, is to provide enough psychological oomph for Trump that people who would be inclined to vote for him just give up and don't show up, so that it helps. And
I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to for the first time in probably 25 years. I'm gonna watch what goes on at the Iowa caucuses. I think you have to, because I think if Donald Trump doesn't win that and win it big, then we're in a completely different political situation on the Republican side.
I mean, I'll go out on a limb and say that DeSantis will win Iowa. I think it's going to be close in New Hampshire, but you never know what those freaks are going to do.
They come in from the deep woods to pull the lever in their voting machines and then go back.
I don't even know if they know what they're pulling. I think that they're pulling a practical joke every single day.
Yeah, New Hampshire is very weird. So we'll have to watch that. I just, there's something artificial, and I don't know what it is, and I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's certainly historic in the sense that we haven't had somebody running for president who isn't currently president, but was formerly president, I guess, since Teddy Roosevelt. I mean,
no, Grover Cleveland. Well, it would be since Teddy Roosevelt.
Grover Cleveland was before that.
Cleveland was before that. Grover Cleveland is the only president who lost a re-election campaign,
non-consecutive terms,
and then came back the next election campaign and took the White House back. Yes, but yes, Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, running for the Bull Moose Party, was the last time a former president was running for president who wasn't in the office,
who wasn't incumbent. But so I mean, it's a weird situation. I'm gonna just say it. I think that Trump's strategy so far has been smart. I think the less he stays out of the limelight, and he's already in the limelight enough, but if he's not out there fucking it up and explaining or creating new controversies, I mean, it seems to kind of fade around him, and he becomes less annoying, less scary, less whatever. Not doing the debates, very smart. Why bother? Because then the debates will just be about the insults he threw, the way the others are reacting to the insults, blah blah blah.
Well, it's worse than that. There's nothing he can do but lose if he goes into a debate.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's really no upside to him participating in those.
None at all. From a political perspective, staying away from the debates is the best thing he could possibly do. Yeah,
I can't find much fault with that strategy. Although that again, I still think eventually he's going to have to come out and start opening his big mouth, and he's going to have to go back to Twitter. I know he does a lot on True Social because I hear that he does a lot on True Social. I don't look at True Social, so I really have no idea what he's out there saying, and I find that oddly comforting.
Yeah, but
I don't have to listen to
on Truth Social, he is expounding religious doctrine to the temple singers.
Right.
And if he wants to
the
reach
thing
people,
is that the liberals hate it so much that they won't join up. They won't send any traffic that way whatsoever.
No.
So they largely ignore it.
Yeah, but I mean, Truth Social is a Trump echo chamber. That's its whole purpose.
That's exactly right. That's why I don't want to join it.
And so, Twitter is a little bit different. By the way, Twitter let Alex Jones back on today or yesterday.
I heard that.
So
whatever, he's entertainment.
Now he's back. Yeah, well, the Sandy Hook families weren't very entertained, but speaking of somebody...
No, they weren't, and they were right to be pissed, but I still don't see how they deserved any money, but whatever.
Yeah, well, it's money they'll never receive because Alex Jones doesn't have $1 billion.
No.
And will never have $1 billion, but he will have that judgment. But speaking of people who had bad strategies, I present you with Penn President Liz McGill. All she had to say when they asked her, hey, look, if somebody's running around your university saying we should kill all the Jews, does that violate your hate speech code? Well, you've already lost. There is no answer. There is no answer to that question other than yes, you cannot go around advocating for the murder of people for ethnic purposes. We're generally going to term that a bad thing. She couldn't even say that. Well, she's gone. And then once the head of UPenn's Board of Regents fired her, he then resigned himself. And of course, you still have Claudine Gray and Sally Kornbluth at Harvard and MIT, respectively, who also failed that question as well. They've been, sort of walking back those statements that they made, their inability to say it. But their inability to say it, I believe, is a direct result of the university's cultural climate that largely wants to excuse anti-Semitism if it is done in the service of the oppressed-oppressor dynamic, and it's done in the service of Palestine. Ideologically.
Okay, well, let's just shorten that down to a nice, easy, usable framework, unless it's based in Marxism.
Yeah, that's really what it is. I mean, she runs what is largely a Marxist institution. It is Marxist in practice as well as in theory, and it certainly has a Marxist social culture. And if she says anything other than what she said, then she's going to face backlash. Let's not forget, and now we have to go back 23 years to Larry Summers as president of Harvard,
right?
Who happened to say, there's probably biological differences between men and women. And it took him about 7...
And he specifically cited the bell curve. Well, I think it was the book, but what the data presented in the bell curve, and how, there are more smarter women at the middle, although it's really close.
It doesn't matter.
There's
it violated
a lot more stupid men.
Doesn't
there's
matter.
A lot more really smart men.
Violated the ideology. He was gone in a week.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm kind of, what surprises me is not that Liz McGill had to resign. It surprises me. No, that's what surprises me, It didn't
that
surprise me
had to
what she
resign.
said. It surprises me that she had to resign.
You know,
I'm not even
I was
sure where that came from, other than they had several donors apparently who called up UPenn and said, "You're not getting another penny from me."
Yeah, the big one I think was at UPenn. Yeah,
Yeah, with like a
it
hundred
was like $100
million.
million.
Yeah, $100
Yeah,
million dollars.
but you remember how last week we were talking about, how the sides are just so far apart, right? Two separate circles on a Venn diagram, and we used to at least have some intersection. Well, that might be the last intersection that Americans who aren't real caught up in news or, you know, any of this other crap that we obsess about probably far too often, but it's at least interesting. But the thing that they may disagree with each other on lots of things, but discrimination is discrimination. And there's still lots of people who learned something about World War II, not many that were alive during that era. Um, but there are still people who were, and there's a memory there. There's a real fact and evidence driven memory there that is hard to dismiss. That's one thing that we still have is, Americans root for underdogs. That's
Well,
just sort of our nature.
maybe in the
And the
general,
Israelis are the underdogs.
maybe in the general population, that's something we still have.
I think in the general population.
I don't think,
and I think that's what's getting leaked through, that they have gone too far, because it's even splitting the left on this particular issue. There are a lot of lefties who believe that Israel has the right to exist, and that believe that Islamic terrorists are terrorists. They have no problems recognizing what this situation is. But the dyed-in-the-wool Leninist Marxists who run most of these institutions, they stick with their framework. They don't go to facts. They go to how to spin the facts. And they don't comprehend that you can't just spin this. There's so much evidence of what actually happened. You're defending the most horrific, like inhuman atrocities possible in order to make your side look politically good. And people pick up on that pretty quickly, even if.
But look, you don't even have to extend out to October 7th and Hamas and the Israeli thing. We don't even have to go there when you have people running around on your campus saying, let's kill all the Jews.
And that exacerbates it. But that's what I mean, is that cleave. All these people who are running around saying, supporting Hamas, they really thought that they would be followed by their fellow travelers. They didn't realize how much of a breaking point that actually was.
Yeah, I think it's been hilarious to see in Hollywood the number of people who've come out and, for Hamas, and then, okay, well, we'll just uncast you from this show or that show.
Last I checked, aren't there a lot of Jews in Hollywood?
Yeah, well, there is also that. Metro Goldwyn.
Did you think there might be a chance you might offend some of those important people?
Yeah, well, I think they've learned that the hard way. Somebody else who should learn something the hard way is good old Larry Fink at Blackrock, who has decided he's no longer using the term ESG because it's been...
I'm going to pick another way to lie to you.
Politically weaponized. He's ashamed to be part of this debate. Notice that he doesn't say they're not going to do ESG investing anymore. Notice he doesn't say...
Just going to call it something different.
Yeah, notice he doesn't say we were wrong about that. And although he did complain about Ron DeSantis in Florida pulling, was it $20 billion out of
his
out of Blackrock, and saying it really sort of affected our bottom line. But he's pulling on this whole more sorrow than an anger deal about ESG, and I cannot listen to this guy talk without just getting absolutely livid. We're talking about a guy who has $9.2 trillion under management. And probably the majority of that is coming from 401ks, where the people who invest have no
institutional
say.
investors, right?
Yeah, the people who invest have no say in what Blackrock does with their money. And I have, on occasion, sort of gone back and forth on this issue, but watching what Vanguard has done and what BlackRock has done has really put me firmly back in the Milton Friedman camp of you have one job, and that is to return the maximum amount of money for your investors. And that is your only job. You have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize their returns, because these are people who have no control over their retirement funds, or at the very least have very limited choices in what they can do with their retirement funds. And they certainly have no control over what your particular fund invests in if they invest in your fund. They are solely captives to your investment decisions. And the second you make an investment decision for anything other than maximal returns, you are stealing money from their retirement. And
you're breaking your fiduciary duty.
Yeah, and I don't understand why nobody has come up with some sort of class action lawsuit to just sue Vanguard and BlackRock for violating their fiduciary responsibility. I think probably you would have to prove that the investment decisions that they made for ESG investments were in some ways less profitable than the investments that they could have made.
You'd have to do a lot
otherwise
more than that.
It would be extremely hard to do. But this idea that I can use your money over which you have no control to invest in things that align with my political ideology is just something that sticks in my craw very, very hard.
Yeah. And the fact that it's so unavoidable. I mean, you have no idea if your stuff's invested with BlackRock or not. I mean, it's safe to assume that even if you have index funds, at least something in there is going to be invested with BlackRock. I mean, it's almost impossible to avoid it. So, yeah, it is. There's sort of a monopoly there, I guess. What actually suing them for using this criteria for their investment decisions is nigh on impossible. I don't know where they're registered. I'm going to assume it's either Delaware or New York. Two of the places that have the strongest protections for managers and your officers, your board members, whatever. And when it comes to decision making, it's a very, very high bar. So they are pretty safe, unless they promise something different in their prospective materials or in their, they lied in their Q4s or something. I mean,
yeah, but
this is
the problem is, how do I prove that I used that my investment advisor used the wrong criteria to make investment A, that he should have invested in investment B? I've got to prove that he knew about investment B, that he had the opportunity to invest in investment B, that it was evaluated along with investment A, and that he knew investment B would be a higher return investment. But then again,
well, and here's the other thing too: is
it gets so complicated. I don't know how you prove it.
Losing money? Has BlackRock been losing money? If they're not losing money, they're still providing returns.
Yeah, then it becomes
that's even a tougher road.
Yeah, because then your argument is, well, it could have been better. Well, maybe, right? Yeah, maybe it could have, but how do it woulda, coulda,
the juries that are sympathetic to that argument?
Yeah. Well, and look, there are some things that you can sue them for that, okay, you've got a pretty good chance of winning. You're 75 years old and they put all of your money into a single stock. Okay.
Yes. That would be basic mismanagement.
Yeah, that would be mismanagement of funds. You do not have the ability to absorb the amount of risk on a single stock with your entire portfolio. In fact, they should be throwing you into, I hate to say it, treasuries so that you have guaranteed income. That investment should be paying you back on a quarterly basis, or whatever the coupon payment is. So suitability is low hanging fruit. Anything other than that starts to get iffier and iffier. And this whole ESG thing, and by the way, I can't help but think that they know that they're almost immune from.
Oh, they know.
From any sort.
They know. Their lawyers have told them, you're sacrosanct here. Your decisions are not challengeable.
It would be impossible to prove. So there is a way that you could beat them, which would be to ensure that none of your money ever goes to them. To pull out.
That's really the only way, though. To
find another investment company. Unless, of course, you're investing in a 401k. In which case...
Which you have no idea.
You don't know. And I as of the last time I looked, something like 54% of Americans were invested in the stock market. And that is a historic high, and it all looks good, but until you realize that of that 44% or 54%, 53.9% of that money is coming out of 401ks. Where, you know, I can say, I want to invest in this fund because it looks like it gave me money back that's good. And okay, well, you know nothing about that fund. It's management. Sure, there are prospectuses and stuff, but you're a pipe fitter. You're probably not really up on how to read a prospectus. I mean, you might be,
true,
but most aren't. And so, it's a lot like the famous experiment of buying stocks by monkeys throwing darts at a dartboard. You don't know, and you're a monkey throwing a dart at a dartboard, and you don't know what the investment strategy is your best bet is just to buy an index fund, right? Just get an S&P index fund. That's about the only thing that's even...
I was going to say, throwing darts at the dartboard is about... You're going to achieve about the same return as an average index return.
Yeah.
That's how random it is.
Yeah. So it just irks me because they have all of this money coming in, much of which is coming in from people who don't know what they're doing with it. They get this entire pile of money to play with. They get to play their ESG/DEI games with that money. Is it providing good enough returns? Prove that it isn't. How can you? We don't know on a day-to-day basis.
You've got $9.2 billion trillion dollars under management. You can take all kinds of bumps in the road. You have so many different upsides. Talk about diversity of interests. I mean, you are so hedged out, it's almost impossible to lose.
Yeah, and plus, on top of that, just on top of the 401ks, and now Florida was only $2 billion of that $9.2 trillion. California is probably a lot bigger. I am kind of surprised, maybe it's ideological as well, that state pension funds aren't pressing people like Vanguard harder as well. California laughably looks at the CalPERS retirement system and laughably tells us that, oh yes, this system is just fine and everybody is going to get their money. All we have to do is make 9.8% returns every year and it'll be just great. And there'll never be a problem. We're golden. That's not going to happen, but literally CalPERS.
Well, the other thing too is that
CalPERS has said that.
Yeah, I was going to say, aren't CalPERS and like all the state pension funds, aren't they backed by the PBGC?
Probably they would be, yes.
So they have no incentive to bitch or whine or moan.
I guess. And of course the idea is that even if this whole thing comes crashing around our ears, the feds will have to jump in.
Exactly. There's going to be a bailout.
Because
which
we're too big to fail.
The federal government an interest. I don't know if it would, actually equate to standing, but it'd be nice to see somebody make that argument. But that would require the federal government to get up its ass and do something.
Yeah, look, the federal government wouldn't get up off its ass whenever Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush sent their cabinet secretaries before Congress and said, you have got to shut down the CRA because the housing market is going to go bust. And Congress told them, hey, how about this? Why don't you go screw? And we're going to ensure that in fact, we're even going to attack the creditworthiness standards to ensure that more people get loans. And that's exactly what they did. And that's how we got to 2000. Oh, and by the way, let's not even talk about the SEC not even looking at all of the subprime crap that Moody's and Standard & Poor's were rating as AAA because they were diversified investments when it was 98% double B and C or lower junk because these were subprimes.
Tranches.
Yeah, tranches. Yes, these tranches. Hey, throw in enough tranches and it magically is diverse, but it's tranches of shit. So
yeah, exactly.
10 tranches of shit is a big pile of shit. It's not a AAA rated mortgage bond, but the SEC never did anything like that and never looked at the ratings.
Standards
and
or
by
Moody's?
the way, yeah, nobody at Standard & Poor's and Moody's spent a day in jail. Nobody got prosecuted.
Not even got investigated.
Or any of the investment firms like Bear Stearns or Deutsche Bank or any of that.
Goldman Sachs,
all of whom were pushing out these derivative products based on tranches of shit to multiply the amount of monetized shit in the market by 100 times, and who are hiring physicists to say, these risk rules. You can actually push these leverage ratios up to, 70, 80, 100. Who cares? It'll all be fine because we've done the math. And physics tells us that the chance of this all going south is just very low.
Right.
So,
but we're diversified.
Yeah, everybody had a party.
We have triple B and double B.
Yeah, everybody had a party. The feds did nothing, and it almost ended capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I remember back when it was going on, and we were talking about it, and I was like, this is, the Fed thinking that it's going to get hit on the real estate market, that these trends are never going to stop, that we're just going to keep having these double-digit home prices go up forever, and your investment will be so sound because they'll never come back down again.
What kind of moron, Michael Burry, thinks that the housing market is going to collapse?
Right.
Nobody.
That is literally that was the philosophy at the time of the FDIC, of the SEC, of the Fed, and certainly of the federal government.
Yeah, housing market can never collapse. It's never happened. Except in 1929, you morons.
Yeah, when we saw what happened at the beginning of the 80s, too, the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when interest rates were, if you got a 13%, 14% mortgage rate on your home, you were done. I will take it.
Yeah, 14% over 30 years? Yeah, great. I do have to say, one of the nice things about buying a house in 2001 was being able to refi to a 15-year a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And paying less than 2% interest for a 15-year loan. That was maybe the best thing that ever happened to us out here. So we were super happy with the way that worked out. In any way, I know that you can't hear it because I didn't turn on original sound for musicians on Zoom, although it is turned on now, so you should be able to hear in the background that our music is playing, which means we're pretty much out of time. So Michael, as always, great talking to you. We'll talk to you again next week.
See you later, buddy.
And for the rest of you, you have been watching the Observations podcast for Sunday, the 10th of December, 2023. As always, we thank you for joining us for the podcast. We hope you'll join us again the next time. In the interim, have a great week. We'll talk to you later. So long.